Well, hello, everybody. Welcome. We'll be getting started in just a few minutes. And thank you for being here and for making space for this conversation today. We'll give it a minute or two for anybody else to join in. All right, so I do want to go over just some of the basics before we get started. This presentation will be recorded. Cameras and mics will be turned off with the exception of the presenters. On the top, you will find a question section for Q&A. We will have some time at the end to address what we can. I will be providing the Q&A and recording in the July newsletter, so keep an eye out for that. I'm just checking some technical aspects. If you do go to the Q&A section, you will see I have a question already in there. If you're able to see it, you can click the thumbs up icon and let us know that you're hearing me and you are seeing the questions. All right, I'm seeing some interaction there, so I'm taking it that we are live. And we'll get started. So I'll first start out by introducing myself. My name is Dan Dickinson. I am late diagnosed autistic adult with ADHD and dyslexia. I'm also the founder of NeuroDiverse Inclusive Solutions. I've spent years learning how to survive in environments that weren't built for me. And for a long time, I didn't know who I was or why I was struggling. And that's why I'm here today. And that's why this session matters. This webinar is called Autism is Not a Bad Word. And I want to take a moment to explain what that means and why it's important. And when people hear autism, they often usually picture one kind of person. Maybe it's a kid running off screaming, or a child who seems locked in their own world. Whatever that image is, it's usually a stereotype, and it's far too narrow. But autism is a valid neurotype. It's not just a personality flaw or a checklist of symptoms. It's a way of processing the world socially, emotionally, physically, and cognitively. Some of us use words, some sounds, movements, visuals. Some of us do it quietly, with no one seeing how much effort it actually takes us to stay regulated. But autism doesn't always have to look like struggles. When I say autism is not a bad word, I mean it. It's not something to fear or pity. It's not an insult, not a tragedy. It's not a reason to lower expectations or ignore real needs. It's also something you don't grow out of. I'm not less autistic because I've learned to cope. I've just gotten better at navigating the systems that weren't designed for me. This webinar is about breaking the spectrum wide open, so we can talk honestly about autistic traits, regulation, and real support. It's also about naming the harm that happens when we rely on shallow assumptions or service level. You'll hear personal stories, you'll hear clinical insight, and you'll leave with tools to reframe how we think about autism without shrinking it to a stereotype. We're not here to narrow the definition, but we're here to expand the understanding and to make space for people who've been excluded, misjudged, or unseen. So with that, I'm going to bring in Dr. Jami to start the conversation around what autism is and how those definitions shape the way people are seen and supported. And I'll let Dr. Jami introduce herself now.
Great, thanks, Dan. I am Dr. Jami Heyting. Most people have a really hard time with my last name, so that's why I go more informal with the Dr. Jami. I myself am also autistic and ADHD. I also was late diagnosed. I was diagnosed ADHD at just before I turned 40. And autistic when I was, well, it was late 2023, so I was 42 at that point. But as Dan was saying, it's a lifelong neurodevelopmental disorder. So we've both had it our entire lives. It just went unnoticed. So I'm going to give more of like the clinical background information on how autism is diagnosed. I do want to give a little bit of background about my medical practice. So I am a naturopathic physician. I do autism and ADHD assessments for adults. And so I'm helping to address that, those of us who fell through the cracks. I'm also provide ongoing support to this population as well, our population, our peeps, so to speak, and other addressing other medical needs, because there are also a lot of co-occurring things, medical issues that do come up with neurodivergence. And so we're going to introduce the DSM criteria, because that's how diagnosis is made. So I'm going to go through just like an overview of how the criteria is, the different parts of it, and what is needed to meet those parts of the criteria. Oh, sorry.
I'll have Dr. Jami, if you can go over just the basics of, in the clinical sense, what is autism?
Okay. Thank you, Dan. So it is defined by social communication differences and restricted and repetitive behaviors. And so, again, I will go into more detail. We also, with the diagnosis, assess support level needs. I do want to point out that just because a support level is given at the time of diagnosis it's dynamic, and so it can change throughout life. And so somebody might initially be diagnosed as support level 1, that is needs support is the clinical wording on it, and then support level 2 is needs significant support, and then level 3 is needs very significant support. And so as you can hear, that is very vaguely worded, and so it and clinically they haven't really done that great of a job about specifying what is the threshold of the needs. And so people can move from 1 to 2 and vice versa, depending on how much support they're able to access. Usually the support level 3, being the highest level of needs, is not as dynamic in that, because they're generally requiring a really high level of support where oftentimes they're living in group homes, sometimes even in institutions. And they're usually have other co-occurring issues going on as well. There is, as Dan was saying, there's stereotypes that come into play and really contribute to the misunderstanding or incomplete understanding around what autism means. And so for example, when we do have a level 3 support needs and they're nonverbal, what can happen is that the community will end up making assumptions that that person also has intellectual disabilities, and they'll talk down to them. They'll act more infantilizing towards them, which is a real shame, because just because you're nonverbal does not mean that you don't have the capacity to understand. And so we're trying to get away from that. I'd also like to say that even when somebody has an intellectual disability, I really want to emphasize still not talking to them as if they're a baby, because I feel like it's disrespectful. Obviously, you do need to adjust speech and language to help meet them where they're cognitively at. But it doesn't have to be in this diminishing, judgmental way. Another point that we want to emphasize is that a lot of the diagnostic tools that are out there, the standardized tools that are available for assessment, they are designed more catching those stereotypes, and are, the early studies and the early diagnoses were of affluent white boys, and so a lot of the language is oriented around that. And so a lot of times the reason we're seeing a lot of these late diagnosed, especially people assigned female at birth, is because of how the diagnostic tools are worded. So it's missing masking, and it's missing trauma history, and it's not necessarily accounting for different sensory processing patterns or even language processing patterns. And so an example of that might be like when we take language very literally, and a question in the diagnostic tool is worded such a way, we might have a completely different interpretation of what that question is even asking compared to what the author of the assessment tool was aiming to ask about. And so we might not even be providing the same info as what it's trying to get to. This is part of why I became involved in doing assessments as a fellow autistic person, fellow neurodivergent person, is because of having that insight as from my lived experience. And so and I have definitely noticed language in those tools that make assumptions, and about the understanding of the neurotypical understanding of how things are worded. And so I will often have to do some level of translation of this is what they are intending on asking about, even though this phrase comes across this certain way, and I totally take it this way too. But what they're really asking about is this. And so additionally, so I'm going to shift away from talking about the kind of the structure of the diagnosis, but more to how the definition and perspective of autism is changing. We're looking at it more as a processing difference rather than a behavior disorder. A lot of the earlier clinical perspective on it was more targeted to the behaviors, right? Like that ABA therapy was very much looking at getting, and like some of them, like self-harm behaviors, there is that concern of causing harm to themselves or also causing harm to others. And so, I understand why that was a concern, but a lot what was getting spoken out about by adults who had been diagnosed as children and had gone through that is that it was beyond just addressing those types of things, but was really forcing them. They felt forced to learn how to mask in order to be accepted, in order to graduate from the therapy. And there were reports of abuse in a lot of cases. And so that's why it's become so contentious. And going into sensory concerns a little bit, a lot of the challenges we see with folks are coming from having like an environmental mismatch. And so it's the setting that the person is in. So it is, tying into those sensory needs. Some of it will end up hitting on the communication differences. And so when we're looking at addressing those and providing support around that, we shouldn't just be looking at the autistic person. We should be looking at the setting and what is dysregulating about that setting. And not just like what is specifically wrong with this person? Why are they overreacting? Which is a lot of time the experience that a lot of us have had. And Dan and I wanted to point out that diagnosis should clarify and not restrict access to support. That we want to use labels for helping to plan and inform the support, but not be used as gatekeeping of like preventing access. And so we do see that concern, especially in that level 1 group, where people will be dismissed about meeting the criteria because the clinician is like, well, you're successful. You've accomplished this, this, and this. You made it through high school and college or whatnot, or you have a job. And so you must not be autistic because you were able to accomplish these things, but they're not necessarily delving into how much effort and how exhausting that experience was. So I'm going to pass it back over to Dan to transition.
Yep. Thank you. And a lot of great information there. We're going to go over the next couple slides. We're actually going to dive a little bit deeper into a lot of the things that Jami just brought up. But I just want to add, I've experienced passing between support levels all the time, depending on the structure, the demand around me. Support needs aren't fixed. They shift with stress, environment. Just simply your stage of life can change what support needs you need. But with that, let's talk a little bit more about what autism looks like in the daily life, just beyond stereotypes. One reason autism is so misunderstood is because our traits vary. not just person to person, but day to day or even hour to hour. Stimming, shutdowns, masking, dysregulation, these aren't problems to eliminate, they're strategies to survive. Stimming helps regulate input and emotion. I might fidget, squeeze myself, sway. If I found I'm constantly counting things throughout the day. Shutdowns happen when my system can't take anymore. It's not disrespect, it's my brain flipping the circuit breaker. Masking is performance. Smiling, nodding, agreeing while my body is in distress. And dysregulation means I've lost access to my own mind. I've lost executive functioning and can't connect actions to outcomes. There's a difference between automatic and manual regulation. A neurotypical brain will filter background noise without effort. I have to willfully push it out of my mind. And when I was a kid, I'd run out of a classroom. As an adult, I sneak up to my office when I'm overloaded. Same need, same symptom, but a different setting. And at times, different consequences. And this is why behavior plans often miss the mark. They focus on what's visible and not what's driving it underneath. Autistic traits aren't immaturity or disobedience. They're adaptations to a world that doesn't match our wiring. And if you understand how someone regulates, you'll understand how to support them. If you focus only on behavior, you'll keep missing the point. And Jami, can you touch a little bit about how the nervous system reacts to these stresses and difficulties?
Yes. And I apologize in advance if it gets a little science class. I like to joke that if I could sign like a college credit for somebody to when they're listening to me info dump about the nervous system and how the brain works and how the body works, I would totally sign that for them. Here's your half credit for science lab. So yeah, I'll go into a little bit of info about the nervous system. So I think a lot of us, we're familiar through our experiences, but I think a lot of us have also heard in mainstream about the fight or flight response, that sympathetic nervous system response. It is there because it's there to protect us. It's there to keep us alive out of dangerous situations. And what happens for us as autistics is that there is a hyperconnectivity going on in our nervous system that limits our ability to filter out. Some folks may have already heard of synaptic pruning that is supposed to happen as we head into adolescence. That doesn't happen to the same level with autistic folks. They see a lot more connections that persist well on into adulthood. And so that contributes to the sensory overload, that contributes to the communication struggles, especially when people don't provide the level of detail that you might want. So a lot of those are showing up. And if the communication, there's a mismatch in communication across neurotypes, then that can, also activate that overload in that nervous system and get perceived as a threat. And then our behaviors, quote unquote, show up as a protective mechanism, just like if antelope was getting attacked by a lion, that if they can't run away, this is actually more the fawn or freeze response, part of the nervous system. But they'll play dead essentially. But yeah, you'll see that in nature documentaries of like, here's the sympathetic response in action. And so, and our presentation can vary with the context, and our energy levels and how well our support needs are being met. And so the same person, like Dan was sharing about his own experience, might look quote, high functioning. This is part of why we're getting away from those labels. In one instance, and again, like I was saying before, may not get recognized as autistic in those quote higher functioning situations where things are aligned, there are routines in place. But in other situations where that's all, they don't have access to that, and don't have the support in place, may look low functioning in another situation. I always picture Costco at Christmas time as like a situation that would put me in a low functioning setting because of the amount of people and the lights from the Christmas trees and all that. The support that is getting provided should follow the regulation and not the appearance of the person, right? So if they're shutting down, that right, like obviously, like in the moment, you're not necessarily figuring this out on the fly, right? And from a clinical perspective, we're making those plans before somebody gets in that situation. And so we're making those support decisions around that. But like, you know, just because somebody quote looks high functioning doesn't mean that they don't have support needs. And so I can't emphasize that enough. So I'm going to slide it back over to Dan to transition to the next slide.
Thank you for that. And so we've talked about traits and regulation in the moment. So now let's move to talk a little bit about what happens over time. So masking doesn't just hide autism, it reshapes identity. So when you're in those situations, it trains you to disconnect from your own body to avoid being judged. And like as a kid, I was rewarded for being quiet and compliant. I learned very early on that being easy kept me safe. I didn't learn emotional regulation. I learned emotional performance. I smiled, nodded, and I mirrored whether I was okay or not. I didn't know I was dysregulated. I just knew I had to keep it together. And even if that meant shutting down completely once I got home or to a safe place. After masking all day, I spent a lot of time in isolation. The only time I really felt like I didn't have to mask was when I was alone. By the time I was a teenager, I could keep up the mask for hours, but it cost me my ability to notice when I was actually struggling. And people call this maturity. They trained me to believe that putting on a show was just part of growing up. But now I understand that I wasn't being mature, I was being a robot. That's not maturity. That's survival acting like stability. And every time I succeeded, I was praised for coping, not for being okay. The better I masked, the less support I received. No one saw what it took to function because I didn't show anybody. And eventually I couldn't. The mask broke down and I broke with it. The more I mask, the harder it is to unmask because I didn't know who I was underneath all of this. I catch myself masking every day. And I'm still working on discovering who I am without it. And that's the developmental cost. When we teach autistic people to perform instead of regulate, we don't build skills, but we build a collapsing structure. And Jami, can you talk a little bit about how masking affects people over time?
Yes. And I'll actually share some of my own experiences as well in this one. So, as we've alluded to, masking often looks like success, right? Like if we can pretend well enough to fit in with everybody else and not make waves, we look like we're achieving those goals that the clinicians or our parents or teachers had set for us. And again, right, like they're not necessarily seeing what's going on internally for us. My personal experience around this, and again, right, like also contributed to the delayed in getting diagnosed, was that yeah, I sucked it up. I, dealt with the sensory overload. I mirrored other people to figure out how to communicate, made scripts for myself, but tried also not to sound too robotic in how I was repeating things. I do remember tons of occasions where I got accused of mocking people because of doing that. And so I actually applied skills from certain classes, like like an English class where we had to learn how to rephrase, like paraphrase things. And so to kind of like utilize that technique when speaking and communicating of like, okay, how would I do this in this research paper? And so that people wouldn't get mad at getting mocked, right, about me mirroring them. Um, but what happened over time, like, and now, having the experience of learning about psychology, learning about medicine, and, becoming a doctor, I realized that I lived most of my childhood in complete dissociation. And I do personally have like some trauma history as well, which influenced that. But and that transition out of that into again, like Dan was talking about, you eventually get to the point where you just can't keep it up anymore. And so as I was transitioning out of like living in that masked, dissociated state, all the feelings around things, not just emotional, but like sensory too, come flooding back in. And so when you start to unmask, you look way more dysregulated than you ever have been. And if there's that internalized ableism going on where you've absorbed those beliefs around not being able to manage those on your own anymore, then that can feel like, oh my gosh, what happened to me? Why am I not able to do these things? It feels like a loss of skills. And in a way it is, but it's also that loss of that, that's not on you anymore. And actually gives an opportunity. It's hard to see in that moment because you're all activated, but it gives an opportunity to live more authentically. And that's really what we want to try to build. And part of that is getting those supports in place for ongoing care. Um, and again, like Dan was saying, even as adults, we're praised for coping instead of being supported for regulation. And we see a lot of that, adults who were doing fine until they weren't, right? They had the job and then they burnt out, and then they had to quit or they got fired. And that cost of that masking builds over time because the needs weren't actually ever addressed. So it's leading to burnout, it's leading to shutdown. And Dan also shared his personal experience about this too, identity confusion, because you don't really know who you are because you've been masking so long. So it's like, am I really this person that acts like this and does these things, or is that my version of what I think people are supposed to look like, and who am I, and what are my needs, and what are my interests? And we might not have been allowed to really express those earlier on in life. And so right, so that's part of our goal, is to really give that opportunity back to folks. I'm going to transition into the next slide, and again go into that more of that detail around diagnosis and differentiate between autism and some of the co-occurring conditions that can happen. So again, as I said earlier, autism is not the same as intellectual disabilities, the IDD, intellectual developmental disability. You can have co-occurring autism and IDD, but they're separately diagnosed. And so the intellectual developmental disability, that's solely that aspect of having outside of the average IQ, right? So that's that IQ level. Most have a cutoff at 80 for that, and so that's where like that more of those support needs around, where people might have the impairment to problem solve, and intellectually process things. And again, earlier we talked a little bit about speech capacity, like ability around speech, and some folks presenting as nonverbal, and stressing the fact that just because somebody is non-speaking, nonverbal, does not mean that they don't have cognitive capacity. Somebody could have a really high, right? Like they could have a high IQ and be nonverbal, and like that, making the assumption that somebody struggles cognitively just because they're not speaking, really does, again, it's that mismatch, and again stresses that we don't make assumptions. And then there's other co-occurring conditions, like co-occurring mental health conditions, which can stem from intergenerational trauma. They can come from other environmental factors or genetic factors that contribute to all that. Like Dan and I both have the ADHD diagnosis as part of our profile. OCD is another common co-occurring condition. Anxiety is a huge one, and trauma, as I mentioned. And so some of them can come from so this is where like kind of is touching on environmental, but come from the response to trying to cope with our navigating through our lived experience, right? And that pressure to mask and everything. So like such as the anxiety, and talking a little bit about my personal experience again, with my diagnostic process as a patient, as a client, that I went through many diagnoses before finally getting diagnosed autistic, right? I was getting diagnosed with how symptoms were presenting because of my waning ability to cope over time. And so I was getting diagnosed with depression. I was getting diagnosed with anxiety, because that was the response to that mismatch of the support I needed with what I was going through. Again, labels like low functioning or severe or profound, they are shortcuts, or some people might say euphemisms, right? And are not necessarily those clinical part of the clinical diagnosis anymore. They used to be prior to the update with the DSM. And so that's part of why that's still confusing. But with that update to the DSM-5, part of that shift with getting rid of those functioning labels was, again, to emphasize that it's really, really about the support needs for folks. That they're reflecting that perception of the people around the autistic person and not necessarily the autistic person's lived experience. Another note about trauma, we can't make a one-to-one reference of like saying trauma causes autism. Trauma can exacerbate autism, and then unsupported autism can often lead to trauma, right? Like the interactions with others and abuse that can happen in the unaddressed support needs. But they're separate. They're separate but co-occurring, right? And so again, like just like teasing out those different diagnoses, and again, emphasizing the difference in sensory processing, differences in communication, differences in nervous system regulation, that's where we're focusing the emphasis in how we're defining autism now. With that mislabeling or misdiagnosis, it can often lead to mistreatment or mismatched treatment. So I felt like maybe this is me taking the word mistreatment literally, but I want to differentiate between like mistreatment in the sense of abuse, right? Because that can happen, but also that mismatched treatment where the support needs that end up getting recommended may not necessarily match what the individual needs when they're based on that outside perspective only. And this happens in schools, it happens in medical clinics, it happens in workplaces, and based on, like, again, the assumptions that are made about those stereotypes, and then those wrong assumptions lead to the wrong interventions, the wrong types of support. I'm going to pass it back over to Dan to give a little more perspective.
Just want to add, like, this is why it's important to say, like, what autism isn't. I've lived the impact of being misread. I think the majority of us have. Autism isn't just about what people see. It's what we experience internally. It helps. If help only goes to people who look autistic or that act autistic, the rest of us go ignored. So autism isn't a performance, like I've kind of said before. It's not defined by how well I speak or how much I can push through a situation. And kind of going on to that, kind of touching a little bit about our own personal lived experiences and the realities of our lives. So again, we talked about traits, we talked about masking, we talked about how that affects us. But now let's talk a little bit more about how that plays out day to day. For a long time, I thought I was just like anybody else, but I thought I was broken. I thought something was inherently wrong with me. I struggled with tone. I didn't understand pacing or social terms. I took speech classes. I got a degree in communication. I thought if I can just learn the rules, I can stop feeling out of place. But no matter how much I studied, it still felt unnatural. I could speak and work and smile and I can pass. So I assumed I must be fine, even when I wasn't. I didn't understand that masking would work and be harmful. That you can hold it all together, but also still be falling apart. And like I said before, people praised me about how well I was able to adapt. I think even some people used it as my ability to pivot. but they didn't see what that cost was. The more I succeeded, the more I wanted. It actually became kind of like my drug. And the better I performed, the better I felt. I put that on myself, that my self-worth was always tied to my performance. And I even had a situation this morning where I didn't perform as well as I thought I should have. But getting diagnosed, it did have a sense of relief. I finally knew I wasn't broken. I had been acting for so long, I didn't know what to do next. The mask was completely running the show. Trying to find who I am now feels like a recovery process. The withdrawal hits just as hard. There are times every day where I would rather just go and work all day long. The imposter syndrome, and it runs deep within me, especially in any late diagnosed adult. We get called articulate or driven or too smart to need support. But that's not true recognition. That's erasure of who we are. Autism isn't about what people see from the outside. It's about how you experience the world. And internally, the system keeps rewarding people who can mask until they just can't. Autism isn't just one thing, and it never was. It's we got to stop pretending that it just fits in a single box and seeing people for who they are on their day-to-day basis.
Yeah, Dan, one of the terms that got used for me a lot was resilient, right? Like when you mentioned pivoting earlier, I remember getting called resilient. Oh my gosh, you made it through all this. And I'm like, I'm tired of getting that part of recognition, but then not the support. And it actually does make me think of a meme that it's usually used when it's talking about the burden on new moms, and it's like she's not only dealing with the newborn infant, but she's also worrying about all the like household things. And I feel like a lot of us who've been the high maskers is very similar to that, of like that burden that nobody sees. And we need to stop requiring people to prove their pain. I feel like that ties into the "you don't look autistic." It's like, okay, do I need to like look exhausted in order for you to believe me? And the identity and care, it should not be conditional on that visible struggle. The labels like mild, severe, high functioning, profound, as we alluded to earlier, they're not the diagnostic categories. They're the social descriptions that are reflecting that external perception and not the internal experience. That term profound autism was actually introduced not that long ago. It was a 2021 Lancet article, the Lancet Commission, and it was used to describe individuals that were level 3 autistic, and they were experiencing co-occurring intellectual disability. They had limited language skills, and those high support needs. The problem isn't the idea of describing need. It's using these labels without context. If you just use the label and just make assumptions that it means the same thing every time, that's doing a disservice to everyone. And so what we need to do, right, is have the more accurate assessments of what regulation needs people have, that support, and those co-occurring diagnoses, right? Because if people are having co-occurring OCD, for example, or trauma, right, those require additional specific therapies for those diagnoses. And so if you just label it, quote, profound autism, it doesn't necessarily address those needs. We again emphasize that autism is a neurotype and not that severity scale. That the speech ability and the behaviors, they don't tell the whole story. The regulation, the comprehension, and the sensory needs are the aspects that are really like we need to be more specific in addressing. Again, those many people with those high support needs have multiple diagnoses. And other ones that might be present are seizures, other language or motor conditions. They need to be identified, diagnosed, and supported independently. When everything is rolled into autism, people can often lose access to those other services that they need. And when you have less visible support needs, many of us have the experience where we get questioned about like seeking out that help, that support, and we're not believed, right? A lot of people have experienced this when they've gone to apply for disability services, right? Like autism is a recognized disability that meets that criteria, and because of the assumptions made by what we look like, we don't look autistic enough. People end up getting denied in that process, and even I've even heard about experiences where there's one of the tools that's used is looking at people's functional abilities in at the time of assessment, and or when they're going through the disability services application process. And I've heard about a number of cases where even with those scores showing impairment and support needs, people still getting denied even with that aspect because their autism was level 1. And so again, just like focusing on what is shifting that focus, and yeah, just having a more affirmed approach in the medical system, and I think we'll do a much better job about meeting the needs of people. So Dan and I had a big conversation around what our perspective on diagnosis looks like. Again, this is like our focus, our things that based on our experience in our own lived experience with autism. I don't usually like phrasing it that way, as autistic people. And we were saying, like, it often seems like level 1 has, generally has that ability to self-regulate. Often we can have co-occurring conditions where that we do need to have support needs, but a lot of the stuff might already be in place or be actively in place at that time of diagnosis. And then with level 2, that level may require a little bit more of that external regulation where they have a support worker working with them to help them access like shopping for groceries or things like that. And then level 3, as we were saying, we're often seeing that be autism plus the cognitive impairments, language, need for language support, need for additional medical support of co-occurring medical conditions. And again, really, really want to emphasize that the diagnostic clarity needs to inform the support and not gatekeep access or reinforce the stigma around those stereotypes.
Yeah, and I do want to spend a little bit more time on this. It's something that I do see misused, especially online, especially within social groups, quite a bit. And I've talked to families who are being told by clinicians, your child has autism, but no one explains the cognitive disability. No one names the trauma history or the speech disorder or motor planning issues, or even if AFRID being separate from autism. And they're stopping there. The parents and individuals aren't being informed and they're just checking the autism box. But that shouldn't be happening. If this sounds familiar, definitely ask for a full diagnostic picture. You deserve to know what's actually being observed, not just the label being placed on it. And have you encountered that at all, Jami?
Yeah, again, it depends on, I feel like some areas have more resources than others, and I feel like that's highly informed by that, where um, it kind of gets skirted over if like the clinician knows that there's not many local resources to connect people with, and so it it just like gets like mentioned as like it as if it's an aside, and which again I feel like is a disservice, because it's like, how do you know that that family is going to live in the same region forever? And we, we have the internet, right? So it's not like, oh well, if we don't have access, why bother telling somebody? But again, right, like I have the perspective of I'd rather know something than not. And and so just because I'm not told about something doesn't mean it's not still there. And so I much prefer to be told, like I think about cancer, right? Like I'd rather know that I had cancer because it's going to be there in my body, regardless if I'm told I have it or not. And so I'd rather be told so that I can do what I can around managing it. And so I feel like when these other aspects are brushed over, like, I don't know, right? Maybe my example is extreme, but it's not providing the whole picture. And again, like my background being in naturopathic medicine, that's like the foundation of our approach to medicine is seeing the whole picture, seeing the whole person. And so it feels wrong not to look at those aspects.
Thank you. And I do want to bring up that we are definitely going over the hour. We'll stay and finish out the slides, and we'll give the whole picture. It's definitely good information to provide, but I just want to make sure that we're respecting everybody's time here, and acknowledging that we do understand. There will be a recording put out if you're not able to stay. But kind of coming back to what Jami was saying, like I totally get it. When people hear extra diagnosis, or when a doctor provides a diagnosis like an intellectual disability, or 5 different diagnoses for one person, it it does create panic. It makes people afraid that themselves or their child would be seen as less than. But it's instead of naming the disabilities, everything gets rolled into autism. And like Jami was saying, that holds back the actual support needs that might be needed for that person. And like, yes, you're autistic, but what you're seeing may be more, and that language is important. And so I actually put together a kind of an image for that. And a lot of people think of the spectrum, so forth. But I can imagine 2 crayon boxes, both labeled autism. One labeled high functioning and the other low functioning. And if you see what's inside the box, I have each box has an autism crayon. but one box may have an IDD or seizures or apraxia. My personal box, it has ADHD, dyslexia, even single-sided deafness. Yeah, my deafness makes things harder. I already miss social cues, but now I sometimes mishear words completely. I've responded in ways that don't make sense to anybody. And that's because I didn't hear it. But in those moments, my autism might seem worse. But, and I was overloaded in two fronts. I wasn't more autistic. I was navigating two different disabilities. That doesn't mean I need a hearing aid to treat my autism. It means I need support to see the whole picture. There isn't just a diagnostic problem when within a workplace, and a workplace hears this person's autistic. A lot of assumptions are made instantly. But autism looks different for everyone because each person has their own mix of needs, strengths, stressors. If we don't name those layers, we misunderstand people on multiple directions. We may underestimate someone who needs layered support, or we may dismiss somebody who appears capable, but they're burning out behind the scenes. And that's why I say autism is not a catch-all term. It's part of a layering system and naming those layers, that's part of what makes us who we are. And kind of want to go into a little bit about something Jami particularly specializes in too, is when diagnosis isn't attainable, what next steps need to be taken and what does that look like?
Right. So there's, as many people have probably experienced, myself included, that so first we're talking about adults facing the barriers to diagnosis. The costs of getting private assessments is usually pretty big. A lot of clinicians providing assessments are not necessarily billing insurance. Because what they were usually facing is the insurance reimbursement rates were low. And so it's like that double-edged sword of meeting the needs of the patient or client population, but also being able to sustain the cost of staying in practice. I personally, in my clinical practice, I do take insurance, including Medicaid, because I'm more I'm more focused on creating that access, and have enough other, right. Like, I'm not just doing assessments, and so that's not the only patient population that I'm serving. And so it's my not necessarily to go into all the business aspect detail as a clinician, but the more important thing to me is creating that access for folks. The other thing that comes up is having a lack of qualified or affirming providers, right? And so you might have a qualified provider, and that was my experience too, is the initial assessment that I went and had done as an adult that didn't end up with a diagnosis. I had to do a second assessment, which was a second expense. And I recognize I'm privileged to have been able to do that. But the first person that I worked with was not affirming, right? Did not look at that masking aspect or brushed over it, and minimized it. And I remember one of the phrases that had gotten used was either you're the most amazing masker ever, or you're not autistic. And I was like, well, thanks for saying I'm an amazing masker, right? Because I'm like, yeah, I'm pretty sure that's what's going on. Yeah, so I think it's really important to get more of us providers out there that are affirming. And I personally think it's a big asset when we do have providers who also have that lived experience that we've had, because you don't have to go through that extra step of explaining who you are and how you think and the way you process things, because you have a clinician that knows. Obviously, we're still gonna delve into that and ask for more detail, especially if we're autistic and detail oriented ourselves. Other barriers include wait lists of a year or more. I've heard folks report like having to wait 2 years to get an assessment. I mentioned the insurance roadblocks, and touching more on that. The importance of having affirming providers. There's clinician bias that shows up, and especially for populations like women, assigned female at birth, BIPOC populations, LGBTQ, and like I mentioned, the high masking individuals. And so again, this is why I have emphasized my clinical practice with these groups. And then when people get into the system and get diagnosed, the diagnostic tools are often missing the trauma, they're missing burnout, they're missing that intersectional experience with, like in that BIPOC population and the LGBTQ population. And the observations end up being subjective and context dependent. The functioning labels are still applied in certain settings. The diagnosis can be helpful for like the documentation and system access, especially like when people are navigating accommodations in the workplace, and having insurance coverage for the related support, or legal protections around like the Americans with Disabilities Act. But again, right, we're emphasizing we should not be gatekeeping identity with the diagnosis or gatekeeping access to tools or other supports. Dan and I and other affirming clinicians see self-diagnosis as valid when it's grounded in those regulation patterns, that life history, those direct needs, real needs of autistic people. Many people come to clarity through community before they ever meet with a provider, right? They're the friends that they've made, and support groups that they've connected with, like end up validating that the autistic identity before they're many times before they're even clinically diagnosed, or they might not even end up clinically diagnosed, but they have found that support system in other ways. The medical system is slow, right? And people need care now. And so we need to put more trust in people's narratives around their lived experience, and especially when those nervous system patterns are consistent over time. And I wanted to shift back over to Dan to share a little bit more of his personal experience with the diagnostic process. Oh, but he's still.
I think with what you said about self-diagnosis, that's where I started. I didn't wait for a diagnosis to start understanding who I was. But I did need the language for what I already knew was true. What actually helped me the most wasn't in a test or an assessment. It was actually hearing somebody say, "You're not broken." And we hear this a lot, and the different, not less. The "you're not broken." Those are statements that are actually very meaningful, especially in pre-diagnosis or self-diagnosed autistic people. And so just want to get into, I saw this question even pop up in the Q&A section, is inclusiveness and support. So this is where the NeuroDiverse Inclusive Solutions comes in. When we talk about naming layers, it's one of the places that, this is one of the places that matters most, especially for autistic adults who are expected to show up and perform in some kind of role. And that even goes with at any age, whether that's at work, in school, in caregiving, or just in the community life in general. Support is not just about what happens during the task. It's about how we show up before, during, and after during our recovery process. In a workplace, accommodations usually get boiled down to logistics: your start time, your task list, your lighting, email format. Yes, those things do matter, but they're not the full story. Real support means understanding how somebody functions, not just how they look while they're performing. You can't support autistic people by copying what worked for somebody else. And that's where support becomes very unique. You have to learn what makes this person regulated, focused, and sustainable. Some people may need extra time before starting a task, just to mentally transition. Some people need written steps, visual guides, or an environmental control to stay on track. Many require downtime or solitude after a social task or a performance. They may need clear endpoints, consistent pacing, and low stimulation spaces. And we have to remember that's not weaknesses, that's regulation. Regulation is what makes performance even possible. Because I can deliver, but I can't do it in chaos. I can't stay productive when everything's urgent and nothing is clear. And I can't stay regulated if I have to mask the entire time. And that, for me, that's not a personal flaw. That's just being autistic. Support means preventing burnout before it even starts. Not waiting for people to crash and then questioning their commitment. It means valuing structure without turning it into control, and offering flexibility without removing clarity. A lot of autistic people have learned how to function in spite of their environment. But what we need is to function is a relationship with our environment. And that means changing systems, not just surviving inside of them. And sometimes that's changing the type of mouse that somebody uses, the type of clothing somebody wears. It can be something so simple as just understanding that individual person and creating the environment that works best for them.
So as we wrap up, again, I wanted to emphasize diagnosis may help with that documentation, right? Because they're often looking for that medical code on there to delineate, here's this reason, this necessity providing this. And again, right, that's under that Americans with Disabilities Act. But it's not the only route to valid needs. And so one of the ways that I approach things in my practice, and I feel like we're running into more of this now with, and I'm like towing this line around. I do not want to talk about politics, but right, there are some real concerns that are coming up with some of the legislative changes or executive orders that have people really concerned about attaining a diagnosis, right? Because there was that whole discussion around sending autistic people to farms and such to anyway, trying not to go down that route. But we still, again, so people might not be seeking out getting that diagnostic label for that. And so the way I've been approaching things clinically is to hone in on those support needs areas, right? And so we can still prescribe and connect access to supports around those needs that are coming up even without that autism diagnosis. And so we can refer to OT for help with like navigating social relationships and things like, again, I used the grocery shopping example earlier just because it's a pretty common one. Most of us have experience with grocery shopping, and so can visualize like the aspects that are involved with that. And we can make referrals to speech therapy, even if somebody's not having like verbalization concerns where like they're nonverbal in that example, but if they're having the support needs around social communication, there is that support there in speech therapy where they can work through with that speech therapist around how to handle those interactions. And again, it's not where there is a lot of discussion and work around how things present in a neurotypical world, and so they're learning about and learning how those interactions happen. The affirming providers are not going to insist that the autistic person is following that, that they demand the masking. And part of the more affirming practices that I've been seeing in those settings lately have been more of that attempt to meet the autistic person where they're at and help with that navigation around, okay, when is it more necessary for me to mask because I'm going to run into this issue in this setting? And then what other things can I do to support myself, as Dan was saying before, during and after that interaction. And again, right, we want this based on real functioning. We don't want it, somebody's not looking autistic. So again, somebody can look fine, but can be burning out after every single interaction or every single task. And so if that's happening, the support plan isn't working. And so we need to shift from that reactive support or reactive response to that more proactive support. And because we don't, burnout does not have to be this inevitable crash that we're all facing. That is a sign of the system failure, and it can be prevented. And again, Dan and I are like gung ho on helping make this happen, and I really appreciate getting to work with him. And I hope you feel likewise. But yeah, I'm really grateful for this opportunity to collaborate on this.
And thank you, Jami. Thank you for that. But I do love your grocery store example, because for myself, even pre-diagnosis, I went through some life changes, job changes, and if I remember back and reflect back to that time, I would actually go to the grocery store at 2:00 in the morning, wearing headphones, blasting music as loud as I can. And that is what got me to go through the grocery store and do all the grocery shopping. And I was affirming my own needs without really understanding even a diagnosis. So there's still that room to be affirming and supportive by understanding the layers of what the person needs rather than just the big picture. But I love that in supporting the individual layers as individual layers really makes a difference. So we did reference a few different things while during this presentation. We referenced the DSM-5, the medical diagnostic codes, and self-assessments. So we did want to kind of put where to access those materials. The neurodivergentinsights.com has a very good outlook on the DSM-5 and explains it very step by step of how you can go through that and have an understanding of what the DSM-5 means and how it's conducted. The IDC10data.com. Now, in the United States, we're using the IDC-10 for medical diagnostic codes when it comes to insurance and the actual clinical diagnosis. And so you can go to the IDC10data.com and you can search the diagnosis, see the codes. I see in the chat somebody was asking about is autism the diagnosis or is it ASD? So that's somewhere you can look to see exactly what the doctor is diagnosing you with and how that is being defined. And then for self-assessments, there's the website embraceautism.com, embrace-autism.com. And that will have a list of different self-assessments you can take. It also gives you an overview of their analysis of which self-assessments are more accurate than others. And it helps guide you through that process of self-assessing, going through the diagnostic yourself. And again, bringing up some of the questions that came up. Somebody talked about a doctor underdiagnosing them possibly. And that is something that comes up. Let me bring up the actual question here. I was told by a doctor that I'm clearly not neurotypical, that I don't meet the DSM for ASD, but that I have mild autism. And as we talked about here, there is no variation. According to the DSM-5, according to diagnostics, you're either autistic or you're not. And so this is a good resource to do your self-assessments and even bring those to the clinician. And that's actually what I did myself, is I took all the self-assessments I can, I brought those to the clinician, and the first thing she said was non-autistic people don't spend 100 hours taking tests on whether or not they're autistic. I think, Jami, when it comes to self-assessment and self-knowledge, as a clinician, when somebody comes in the office with that already, do you find it helpful?
Yeah. I mean, as part of my like screeners questionnaires that I use, do you come from that self-assessment section in the Embrace Autism website? And like Dan was saying, they do like in the overview about the test. So they don't just like post the test, they post the like how reliable, right? Like the statistical validity, which that speaks more to like the psychologists and everybody of like, oh, this is actually going to tell us what we about autism and not be confused with other things, essentially is what that's saying, and whether the results are reproducible. But it also talks about like the clarity of the questions, right? That they're not confusing and vague, or if they are. And so, yeah, I really like that layout in there. I ran into, like I was sharing earlier, I ran into a very similar issue where the original provider I got an assessment through, I met all the, so like like we were saying earlier, the different aspects of that DSM criteria where, so the part A is that social communication aspect, and then the part B is the restricted interests, repetitive behaviors, which includes like the assessment around sensory needs. And with the criteria, and you can visit that neurodivergent insights page to I love the infographics on her page because she also uses affirming language in there too. And so instead of saying, so the DSM itself says persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction, but her infographics, she changes that word to differences to again try to remove some of that stigma. And so that criteria A, there's 3 separate sections to it. You have to meet examples within each of those sections. Criteria B has 4 sections, but you just have to meet 2 of the 4. And then there's the criteria C, D, and E, and C goes into assessing whether the traits have been present lifelong. And again, right, autism is a developmental disorder, so they have been. And then criteria D is showing like where they're impacting you in current daily life, right? So is it interfering with relationships? Is it interfering in the workplace? And then criteria E is where a lot of us, when we're getting denied diagnoses or getting underdiagnosed, is where we're getting excluded by certain clinicians, because that the criteria E is saying this, in order to meet the criteria E, it's saying these traits are not better explained by another condition, right? Another mental health condition, another developmental disability, another global developmental delay. And so because there's still that level of stigma around autism, and so some clinicians will still avoid it even in the face of like the obvious presentation. And again, right, like that's goes back to the, oh, you don't look autistic, or you're too successful, and they're I think many of them mean well, but it ends up doing more harm than good to withhold that diagnosis because it's withholding support, right? And again, like we were saying, like, if you can get other clinicians or other support things in place without that diagnosis, and it is possible, right? We were highlighting that is possible. You just have to find that affirming team. Right. And so it is super frustrating, though, to go through and then put that financial investment, put that time investment, emotional investment, right? Like it's like, we're putting ourselves in this situation that is like hitting in on all the things that overwhelm us, right? And then to be told, oh, that's not what this is. It's so, like, we're just looking for validation, and it's super frustrating. And so and that's why I share my own experience with it too. And so I know that the Q&A doesn't have names, but like I just want to empathize with you having gone through that of like not meeting the criteria, that most often that's where I'm seeing it's that criteria E that is, they're saying, oh, well, this is better explained by your trauma, or this is better explained by your ADHD. But then it's
I find it very interesting that even a diagnosing clinician that's giving this advice, they're still using the term mild autism. But then they're also saying you're not autistic. Like, that's where that clarity of we do need to push back and, like you said, ask for those more details of like, okay, so if ASD doesn't explain what I'm going through, what does? Mm-hmm. Or why are you saying mild autism? What parts of autism do I resonate with? And getting those details. And unfortunately, we do have clinicians out there providing this type of vocabulary, or they're providing the vocabulary of, oh, you're not autistic, but you have Asperger's. And those are old, outdated terms that just don't give that true clarity. So I do want to come to a close on this presentation here today. Thank you all for coming. And if you are watching the recording, I'm glad you got a chance to see this. I do believe that it's very important information for everybody to know and to have a deeper understanding. And thank you, Dr. Jami, for joining me today.
Thank you,
And
Dan.
we do hope to collaborate on some more neurodiverse affirming information going into the future. And there is a larger picture of neurodiversity when it comes to ADHD and other neurological conditions as well. So we hope to be able to speak more about those and get the information out there. And so thank you. I will close from here.